Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to our global audience. Thank you for joining us for the launch of the Military Balance 2021. My name is Bastian Giegerich. I'm the Director for Defense and Military Analysis at the IISS. Today's event will have three segments. The first one will be a statement from the IISS Director General and Chief Executive, Dr. John Chipman. This will be followed by a number of short interventions by selected panelists. And finally, we will open the floor to all here in this virtual launch event to ask questions, and then IISS panelists will be ready to respond. We will wrap up promptly at 11 a.m. UK time. 2 points to note, as we will share a couple of slides with you on screen. We recommend to set your Zoom settings to split screen, and I think you now see a slide that shows you how to do that so you can see the speaker and slides side by side. If you would like to raise a question, please use the Q&A function of the Zoom platform at the bottom of your screens and type up your question. I will then direct that question at the panel. And so it is now my pleasure to hand over to Dr. John Chipman, who is currently working out of the IISS Middle East office in Bahrain. John, the floor is yours. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Today we are publishing the Military Balance 2021 and delivering conclusions from our Military Balance Plus database after a year defined by the COVID pandemic. Joining me to answer your questions today are Dr. Bastian Giegerich, Douglas Barry, Ben Barry, Sir Tom Beckett, Henry Boyd, Nick Childs, Aaron Connolly, Dr. Ewan Graham, James Hackett, Emil Hokayem, Fenella McGurty, and Maya Nowens. Although primarily a public health issue, the pandemic affected defense establishments worldwide. In many countries, troops were deployed to support civil authorities, while some acquisitions were delayed. Exercises were scaled down or cancelled, while some deployments were postponed and others extended. Elsewhere, outbreaks challenged readiness, notably when sailors on ships of the US 7th Fleet in East Asia fell ill. However, armed forces adapted. By June 2020, the US Navy was able to send 3 carrier strike groups to sea in the Asia Pacific for the first time since 2017. While the pandemic has affected nearly every country, tackling this common challenge has done little to improve relations between states. Conflict and confrontation have not abated. In many countries, great power competition has continued to drive defense planning considerations and procurement decisions. The pandemic will affect global defense spending, though it will likely take until 2022-23 for the full financial effect of government responses to start translating into defense budget cuts. Indeed, our database shows that, notwithstanding the pandemic and subsequent 3.5% contraction in global economic output, global defense spending increased in 2020 to reach $1.83 trillion, growing by 3.9% in real terms from 2019 figures. While the largest spending increase in 2020 came in the US, the upward trend continues in Asia, even if growth decelerated there. Spending growth slowed to 4.3% in 2020 from 4.6% in 2019, as several countries, such as Indonesia, South Korea, and Thailand, adjusted their defense budgets. However, many countries simply reduced or deferred planned spending growth instead of implementing cuts. Moreover, the sums being spent in Asia are substantial. Asia accounted for 17.8% of total global defense spending in 2010. By 2020, this had risen to 25%. The increase in Asian spending has been driven by China. While real growth in China's defense budget slowed, it still amounted to 5.2% in 2020, and the nominal increase in China's 2020 defense budget, amounting to US $12 billion, was greater than the combined defense budget increases in all other Asian states. Overall, rises in the US and Chinese defense budgets accounted for almost 2/3 of the gross real terms increase in global defense spending in 2020. In Europe, total defense spending grew by 2% in real terms in 2020. This was more modest than the 4.1% uplift seen in 2019, but the commitments by nations like France, Germany, and the UK to increase their defense budgets in 2021 and beyond signals intent to avoid the sizable cuts that followed the 2007-8 financial crisis, at least in the immediate term. If these spending plans continue on their current trajectory, in 2021, Europe could be the region with the fastest growth in global defense spending. Europe's NATO members have continued to increase their defense expenditure as a proportion of GDP, but they still have some way to go to reach the alliance's recommendation to spend 2% of GDP on defense by 2024. Although the pandemic caused a 7% average economic contraction among the alliance's European members, our database shows that in 2020, only 9 of them met the 2% target. However, the spending trajectory is upwards. From an average of just 1.25% of GDP in 2014, spending grew to 1.52% in 2019 and to 1.64% of GDP in 2020. Average spending as a proportion of GDP has increased every year since 2014 as threat perception sharpened in the years after Russia's seizure of Crimea. China's military modernization continues to drive procurement and R&D efforts in the US and is shaping some Asia-Pacific states' defense policy. An example was Australia's mid-2020 Defense Strategic Update, with its emphasis on conventional deterrence and more capable strike systems. Beijing seems intent on achieving primacy in its littoral areas. The People's Liberation Army Navy has maintained an over-the-horizon presence, with China's maritime paramilitary forces taking the lead and using facilities on Chinese-occupied features in the Spratly Islands as forward operating bases in the South China Sea. China's patrol craft and corvettes are also key to its growing maritime capacity. China's corvettes have more than doubled in number in the last 5 years, reaching 55 in 2020, while the PLA Navy's modernization is also reflected in the retirement of a similar number of older, smaller vessels. Meanwhile, the Navy is also looking to improve its anti-submarine warfare capability. Overall, China's naval shipbuilding has continued at pace. The number of large amphibious vessels has doubled to 6 since 2015, and this number will increase when China's new Type 075 amphibious assault ships are commissioned. The second of this class was launched in 2020, and the third just last month. 2020 also saw the launch of the 8th Type 055 cruiser and 25th Type 052D destroyer. Meanwhile, China is constructing a third aircraft carrier larger than its predecessor. China continues to test its armed forces and also the capabilities of regional states in responding to its activities. The border clash with Indian forces raised tensions in 2020. Flights by Chinese aircraft close to and into the air defense identification zones of Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan have increased in frequency, and Beijing continues to trial more advanced weapons launched from land, sea, and air. China is also developing the capabilities needed to support military operations at range. For instance, China's fleet support ships now number 12, up from 7 in 2015. Increased numbers of Y-20 heavy transports mean that the PLA Air Force has effectively doubled its heavy air transport fleet in the last 4 years. The upward trajectory reflects a desire to boost support and sustainment alongside growing combat power. However, as China's armed forces modernize and its power projection capabilities grow, other aspects of Beijing's plans, such as its drive to improve military training, will be as important in delivering successful and durable military modernization. Russia is also introducing more modern military systems, though on a more modest scale, with continuing problems in fielding new generation equipment, such as the Armata family of armored vehicles and the Su-57 Felon combat aircraft. The emphasis is on modernizing existing platforms and integrating new weapons. In 2020, Russia's Navy continued tests of the 3M-22 Zircon hypersonic cruise missile. Russian naval strike capabilities demonstrated in recent years by the use of sea-launched 3M14 caliber cruise missiles will improve when Zircon enters service. Moreover, Kinzhal air-launched ballistic missiles have been observed on MiG-31K Foxhounds, while Russia has already fielded the avant-garde hypersonic boost glide vehicle. China also continues to develop its hypersonic systems, though it remains unclear whether its DF-17 hypersonic boost glide vehicle has reached initial operating capability. In the US, the Army, Navy, and Air Force are all pursuing hypersonic weapons programs, and more states are showing interest in this capability. Hypersonic glide vehicles and high-speed cruise missile developments are, along with greater numbers of subsonic cruise missiles and UAVs, prompting Western armed forces to renew interest in air and missile defense. Like long-range artillery, air and missile defense was neglected during the West's long counterinsurgency campaigns in relatively permissive operating environments. Azerbaijan's use of loitering munitions and UAVs in 2020 in the short Nagorno-Karabakh war has only boosted interest in air defense. The need to counter faster and more accurate weapons will also mean sharper focus on technologies designed to improve the speed of detection, decision-making, and engagement, as well as the command and control of military operations on land, sea, air, space, and in cyberspace. Armed forces looking to modernize their inventories will have to account for these factors in their capability planning. The challenge will be more pronounced for medium powers that still aspire to full spectrum capability, but lack deep pockets. Indeed, for Western states seeking to develop capabilities that can integrate with US forces on day one of a future high-intensity war, this will raise uncountable questions over prioritization. That said, it is increasingly clear that advanced military capabilities like these form only part of the toolkit of the West's potential adversaries. Strategies and capabilities will also be required to counter the activities of paramilitary forces and also to address the employment of state power through non-state actors or proxy forces. There is also the challenge from other, more insidious activities below the threshold of military force, such as information and influence operations conducted through cyberspace, along with worries about more capable weapons and more assertive potential adversaries. This is perhaps one reason why nations as diverse as Australia and Finland are now asserting that there is reduced warning time of a crisis. These threats pose problems that are best addressed collectively, or at least not by individual countries alone, and may bolster cooperation among like-minded states. Responses to the COVID pandemic could help states to develop the capabilities required to tackle gray zone challenges, not least as the pandemic highlighted the need to improve international information sharing, boost societal resilience, tackle disinformation, and perhaps even to broaden conceptions of defense and security. Moreover, pandemic responses required close coordination of military, government, and civil and private sector capabilities. Doing this and learning lessons from the response might indicate progress towards harnessing the levers of national power in a way that could be effective in responding to future defense and security challenges at home and abroad, in the gray zone, as well as during peace and war. And with that, I hand over to Bastian Giegel.
John, thank you very much for this important statement of conclusions and implications of the data in the military balance and in the military balance plus database. I would now like to turn to some of our panelists here today to add short assessments to this range of issues that John has just discussed. And I'd like to first turn to James Hackett, the editor of the Military Balance. James, John's statement just ended on the issue of resilience and capability. What are some of the emerging lessons of the pandemic for armed forces and for national resilience more broadly? James.
Bastian, thanks very much. Of course, although we're not yet out of the pandemic response, I think it's, of course, certainly the case that armed forces are already looking to learn lessons from the response that began last year. A number of them include how to retain readiness in crises like this. Key among those, I think, will be developing the ability to test personnel quickly and at scale, the ability to create biosecure environments rapidly, and also retaining the ability to rapidly scale up military, medical, and logistic support capacities. Then there's one of the points that John raised in his speech, the implications for training, how to develop more resilient training. And I think in that, you'll see a lot of armed forces look to give greater attention to synthetic training architectures. Also, there'll be greater focus on retaining defense supply chain resilience in future eventualities. And also, I think armed forces have to be aware of the financial reckoning that's coming. That means they'll have to develop better arguments for their military equipment programs. But more broadly, I think it's also worth focusing on perhaps what didn't happen, what capabilities of armed forces were not used in the pandemic response. In other words, not putting all your eggs in one basket and assuming that the next crisis will require the same niche capabilities that were deployed in this response. So flexibility and adaptability will be key for armed forces moving forward. What are some of the broader lessons for societal resilience? Well, refocusing on critical national infrastructure. Are the lists the same? Does it need to be focused instead on areas like the information space, as well as the more physical aspects of CNI that have been traditionally focused on? Again, supply chain resilience, civilian and defense. Looking at dependencies within societies, critical dependencies within societies where a weakness in one area can create cascading effects with potentially unforeseen consequences. And also more broadly, I think, and this is where I'll end, a requirement perhaps to develop a new model of resilience that looks at generating civil-military integration, not just civil-military cooperation. For instance, baking in for a future response, a model that looks to tackle crises by integrating responses across central and local government, across armed forces, but also with civil society and including the private sector, baking that in for future eventualities. And with that, I'll end.
James, thank you very much. Just a reminder that the Q&A function is open, so you can add your questions to the list now, and we will in a couple of minutes then turn to answering these questions. I'd like to turn next to Ben Berry. Ben, the UK is obviously one country that is currently thinking about its capability choices and questions of resilience. We're awaiting the release of the integrated review. What is the most important decision or set of issues for defense that you expect to see in that review, Ben?
Thanks, Bastian. The military balance sets out British military strengths in its Europe chapter. It includes its relatively well-trained armed forces that have a combat ethos, a range of special and conventional forces, and capability balance between combat support and logistic units, as well as strategic lift and a growing military cyber capability. But we also assess their military weaknesses, their relatively small size, manning difficulties, lack of air and missile defense, and poor equipment procurement that has continually imposed delay and extra costs, most recently with nuclear programs and armored vehicles. Now, last year's defense spending increase reversed a decade of financial contraction, and there's significant investment being made in maritime, air power, and research and development of emerging technology. So the futures of the Royal Navy and Royal Air Force appear assured. Not so the British Army, where underfunding and procurement problems mean that it can only deliver half of the armoured forces that were originally planned for 2025. Without the integrated review setting out a clear vision of the Army's role and rapid investment to reverse this potential capability decline, there is a considerable risk that the Army's single warfighting division could lose its military capability with the US and NATO. The Prime Minister's November speech appeared to deprioritise the Army, but any logic for this was not explained, nor did the Prime Minister set out the strategic importance of credible UK conventional forces, for example, in deterring Russia and reassuring UK allies and partners in NATO and elsewhere. The government offers little substantial explanation of its vague Global Britain soundbite, For example, I see a clear aspiration to do more with the UK military and Asia Pacific, and this has been repeatedly signalled by UK ministers. But UK forces can't be everywhere at once. So the integrated review must match rhetoric with a military strategy that sets out clear and credible priorities for capability, for activity and investment. If it doesn't do so, there's a danger that the review would be influenced less by strategy, but more by contractual commitments, UK jobs, and lobbying by interest groups. Back to you, Bastian.
Ben, thank you very much. Speaking of investments and decisions about money, I'd like to turn to Fenella McGurty. And Fenella, we heard in John's statement that defense spending in Europe seems to have been quite resilient in 2020 and looks robust, or looks to remain robust in 2021, despite the economic damage the pandemic has done. What were the key decisions in 2020, and what would need to happen for Europe to be fastest growing in 2021, Fenella?
Thank you. Yes, so 2020 was certainly resilient, yes, as you say, but robust is probably a bit strong, as growth did slow in 2020 because we didn't have that uplift in Germany's defense budget as we did in 2019. And because of that, Europe's share of global spending did decline slightly, but it was still above 17%. Generally, Europe accounts for 17 to 18%, so the drop wasn't too significant. I think what was important in 2020 was that defense spending was maintained, the increases did continue. We've spoken about the measures as a proportion of GDP. Obviously, the 2020 figures are slightly distorted by COVID, which is why it's important to look at what happened up to 2020. So we did see that increase as a proportion of GDP for the last 6 years, since 2014. So I think that does show that recommitment to defense and the that will to perhaps avoid those cuts that we did see in the wake of the past financial crisis. Looking forward, the major countries in Europe do seem to have continued their commitment to defense in 2021. We've seen France and Germany continue with their military financing programs and finance plan, respectively, and the growth that is built in there for 2021 does place Europe on a stronger footing. The primary driver behind 2021 growth in Europe will be that uplift in the UK's defence budget that was announced in November of last year, as Ben alluded to. But obviously it will all hinge on these plans going forward. And obviously we'll have the UK's defence budget released in the next week or two. The other thing that will also determine whether Europe is the fastest growing region will be what China decides to do with its defense budget, which is also upcoming in the next week or so. So if China does have a stronger growth than we've seen in previous years, sort of in the last 5 years where the growth has slightly slowed in China, and there are signals that China's budget might increase by slightly more this year. That slowdown that we saw last year was amidst a slowdown in the economy as the pandemic was just starting in March coming through in March last year in China. So if there is that acceleration in China's spending, then that might affect the figures, but we'll wait and see what happens in the coming weeks. Thank you.
Fenella, thank you very much. I'd like to turn to China now and ask Maya Nawans to come in. We talked about Chinese spending, we talked about Chinese defense modernization a bit already, but there's also the question of what Beijing actually does with the PLA and with an gradually modernizing force. Maya, what are some of the new uses, so to speak, you have observed recently?
Thank you, Bastian. So in 2020, we have seen the PLA continue to be active in different areas of activities. As Dr. Chipman already said, there was a clash that the PLA was involved in along the border, the disputed border with India, but I'd highlight 2 other areas that show us where and how the PLA continues to develop its capabilities whilst it modernizes. And the first is really how the logistics support force of the PLA was leveraged during the COVID-19 crisis in China. This was a first test for the PLA's JLSF since it was established in 2016, and it was tasked with organizing personnel and resources from across China, but also across all service branches, including the Strategic Support Force and others. In particular, it tested the PLAF's rapid mobility and domestic long-range delivery capabilities, as well as the Joint Logistics Support Force to leverage civil-military integration. We saw, of course, the Joint Logistics Support Force make use of the PLA Air Force's Y-20 aircraft, but at the same time, civilian rail and road transport networks were leveraged to a great extent. The question, of course, remains whether these successes can be replicated under wartime conditions and when command structures might shift slightly. And of course, under potentially contested information environments. Secondly, I'd note that in 2020, the PLA continued to conduct frequent maritime and naval exercises around Taiwan. We've seen these exercises, of course, take place in the past, but in 2020, we saw an uptick in the number of these exercises, and in that year, they reached an all-time high, according to Taiwan's Ministry of National Defense. The PLA showed increasing complexity in the types of drills it undertook, particularly in the air domain, with multiple intrusions per day, both at daytime as well as nighttime. And we saw the use of multiple and varied PLA aircraft. Interestingly, most of these exercises have taken place closer to Pratas Island than Taiwan proper. But I think this, again, signals an uptick in the activity that we'll see from the PLA this year and moving forward as it continues to modernize. Thank you.
Mayor, thank you very much. Staying with the China theme just a little bit longer, I'd like to turn to Nick Childs. We have tracked China's growing naval and maritime capabilities for a number of years now, and we've talked about further growth in that capability in the statement. Nick, a simple question: does China now have the biggest navy in the world?
Bastian, thank you very much. It is the case that the Chinese Navy has a larger number of vessels overall than any other major navy. And in terms of overall maritime capacity, Beijing also possesses the largest coast guard and a significant maritime militia. But the big advantage the Chinese Navy holds over the US Navy is in patrol and coastal combatants, or corvettes and below. The US Navy still holds a sizable advantage in principal surface combatants of frigate size and above, and large amphibious ships, for example. So as a result, in terms of another traditional naval indicator of scale, overall tonnage, the US fleet still stands at more than double the tonnage of China. So on that criteria, much larger still. Of course, the rather different profiles of the fleets reflect to a large extent their differing focus and priority missions. Beijing's key advances have been in the capabilities of its new units rather than growing overall numbers. The development of its amphibious shipping is at an important stage, as we've heard, with the arrival of the Type 75 large deck assault ships, which will become operational in the next few years. The US Navy still holds considerable capability advantages overall, but it is being challenged, not least in areas like anti-ship missile firepower. As we record in this year's book, it boasts more than 9,000 vertical launch missile cells on its surface ships to China's 1,000 or so. But retirements of some cruisers will likely reduce the US total as China's rises further. And the fact that Chinese shipyards have been outstripping US ones in terms of tonnage of naval vessel launches in recent years is also challenging the US Navy as it grapples with its future fleet mix, including the development of more uninhabited platforms to make up numbers.
Nick, thank you very much. I'd like to bring in Douglas Barry and turn to the air domain. In terms of tactical combat air developments, it is interesting to talk about, as much as interesting to talk about what has happened, it's also interesting to talk about what has not yet happened. And what do you think overall are the main trends we should be watching in tactical combat air developments, Douglas?
Thanks, Bastian. The real world isn't keeping up with expectations. The future is coming, but it's coming more slowly. and in some ways differently than we expected. Aging combat aircraft fleets aren't being replaced at the anticipated pace, and new technologies aren't being introduced as fast as sometimes projected. Even in the US, they are faced with operating mixed legacy and advanced combat aircraft fleets longer than anticipated, and the US Air Force is revisiting fighter fleet planning assumptions in part because of this. Russia, meanwhile, has yet to introduce its latest multi-role fighter into service, a decade after this was originally planned. China operates almost 2 air forces, a legacy fleet of obsolescent types, and a modern fleet, including a small but growing number of advanced multi-role fighters. It's also telling what we can't yet put into the book. Uninhabited combat air vehicles were originally seen as probably entering US service in around 2010, with the US Air Force, 2015 for the Navy. As of yet, there isn't a UCAV actually fielded. Instead, I think what we will see is, at least in the near term, UCAVs being used as a complement rather than a replacement for combat of piloted or crewed combat aircraft. So what does all this mean? Well, the coming era of crewed combat aircraft will look different, but pilots will remain in real cockpits for some decades yet to come.
Douglas, thank you very much. I'd like to turn to Henry Boyd and ask him to speak a little bit about the fact that the Biden administration is undertaking a review of American military deployments around the world. Henry, what do you think might be the implications for regional military balances in Asia, in Europe, in the Middle East? Henry.
I'd hope it continues a robust demand for the military balance across the world, but talking about the posture review specifically, the Pentagon appears to have concluded that its overall force posture overseas, it's to misquote 1066 and all that, is too big and pointing in the wrong direction. Simplistically, you could characterize the requirement it faces as finding an up arrow for Asia and down arrows for Europe and the Middle East, reflecting a notional whiteboard that has China as the #1 priority, Russia at #2, Iran and North Korea together at 3, and everything else basically at 4. However, this posture review, as others before it, is as much about rebalancing resources between forward presence and contingency or surge forces as it is about rebalancing resources between regions. I think the DoD may really be aiming at here is therefore reducing its fixed commitments where possible in order to improve the size and readiness levels of their potential surge forces, which will be key in peer competition contingencies. This is likely to see reductions in the numbers of personnel and their dependents permanently based overseas, and more short or variable duration deployments of units based in the United States. CENTCOM is bracing itself to take the heaviest hit of the combatant commands, although successive administrations' plans to reduce their Middle East military footprint have had mixed results at best. Europe can probably expect to see a return of at least some of the plans proposed for EUCOM last year, although probably shorn of the Trump administration's emphasis on Germany in particular. Indo-PACOM, home of the pacing threat of China, will likely be the primary beneficiary. Although even here, this is more likely to take the form of more units temporarily surging into theatre than it is an increase in the overall permanent presence of US forces in the region. We might even see reductions in end strength and US permanent basing in places like Japan and South Korea, as has previously been proposed for Europe. And there is the ongoing question of where to base the US's post-INF long-range missile capabilities under development. All in all, this promises to be a hard set of questions for Secretary Austin and his new team to work on over the next few months. And speaking of hard questions, I think it's probably time to hand back to Bastian for the Q&A session.
Henry, thank you very much. We've got a set of questions that have come in, and we will turn to those now and work our way through them. The first, I want to take 3 groups, so to speak, initially. The first is around China and China maritime questions, but it'll affect the other domains as well, so everybody can get ready. There's a set of questions around the defense economics and spending trends, which we will turn to then after that. And there's a question about how to understand capabilities for resilience and how to assess that, that we will turn to after. But let me start with a question that was asked, and it has multiple parts. The first question is why is China increasing its navy? How vulnerable will be the UK carrier once it deploys to the, or when it deploys to the Pacific, to Chinese capability? And perhaps, Nick, you can also add a few lines on British maritime capability in relation to that bigger picture that you painted. But I'll take a few interventions in turn. Maybe I'll start with Maya on the motivations for China's modernization drive. I will then turn to Nick, and then we'll also ask Douglas and Henry to say a little bit about vulnerability, carrier vulnerability as well. Maya.
Thank you, Bastian, and thank you to the audience for the question. So China since 2015 has been on a modernization drive and has in its 2015 white paper, defense white paper, stated that air, maritime, and newer domains such as cyber and space are becoming increasingly important to China's concept of war fighting into the future. These now outweigh the importance of the land domain for Beijing and for the PLA. So as part of that, Beijing has been working on increasing its ability to be able to project power in its priority theater with regards to the main concerns for Beijing, and those are territorial integrity in China with regard specifically, of course, to the cross-strait relations with Taiwan. China seeks to project naval and maritime power beyond the first island chain and the second island chain. That I think is a goal that we'll see develop more between 2035 and 2049. Of course, by 2049, China aims to have a global a military that's able to fight and win wars and project power globally. And so we'll see a prioritization of the Asia-Pacific region for the PLA's power projection first, then moving out more globally. And as I've said before, the maritime domain is a priority for Beijing in this respect.
Maya, thank you very much. Nick.
Thank you, Bastian. In terms of the UK carrier strike capability, which is has just become operational at an initial level and is about to make its debut deployment, as suggested, out to the Indo-Pacific region. The overall question of carrier vulnerabilities in operations in a more contested environment and in the context of peer or near peer challenges has become a very broad one and has implications for all carrier-based navies. The responses, whether it is for the top of the range capabilities the US possesses or the more intermediate capabilities of other nations that includes the UK as it builds up its capabilities, is the context of the threat perceptions and a whole range of systems that would be used. So the carriers can deploy their mobility, but also a range of supporting assets, and these will come together to provide a system of responses. The UK has an initial operational capability and will develop that further over time. So that includes not only its air group, but also to an extent its capabilities in terms of protecting itself with its escorts, with the arrival of new frigates with increased capability. But the key to responses as far as carriers are concerned overall, particularly in terms of near peer threats, are the accumulation of a broader range of capabilities that will include not just national capabilities for each carrier operator, but multinational capabilities as well. And it's interesting that the carrier deployment that's about to take place will be a multinational force. So the UK will have a sovereign capability able to protect itself to a certain level of contested scenarios. But as with other nations, the key to the effectiveness of carriers in a particularly a very high intensity anti-access area denial capability situation will be probably multiple carrier operations and multinational carrier operations to provide a much broader set of defense systems.
Nick, thank you very much. Douglas and Henry, if I can turn to you to just perhaps add a few points on the threat side, as it were, to this question. Can I turn to Douglas first, and then to Henry?
Thanks, Bastian. We'll divide the workload. I'll tackle the cruise missile issue. Henry will do ballistics. In terms of anti-ship missiles, the Chinese have a capable, an increasingly capable set of subsonic and supersonic anti-ship systems, which you really have to deal with. They're a problem, and they will be a greater problem because they won't be coming at you in ones and twos. These will be ripple fired and will present a considerable threat. Henry?
Thank you, Douglas. You well know how much I love to go ballistic. In addition to the systems Doug has named, there is obviously the concern over the PLA rocket force's ballistic missile capabilities. The DF-26 inventory within the rocket force has grown quite substantially over the last 3 or 4 years since it entered service. And the introduction of new brigade equipment sets into what is basically Southern Theatre Command within China indicates a willingness not just to push targeting priority into the first island chain and around Taiwan, the East China Sea, but also further to South China Sea and possibly even to the Indian Ocean as well. So increasing the areas in which these systems can hold hostile vessels at threat. I think one thing to emphasize in how China conceptualizes its capability to hold naval vessels and air carrier task groups in particular at threat is the importance of kind of multiple angles of attack simultaneously. Cruise, ballistic missiles, land-launched, air-launched, naval weapons, subsurface weapons, maybe even unmanned underwater or air vehicles as well. Trying coordinating strike capabilities of all these systems in a small window of opportunity to really cause problems for even a sophisticated carrier task group's defensive capabilities.
Thank you very much. I want to stay actually on the China set of questions for a little bit longer. And I'm going to ask Ewan and Graham to come in a minute. It's a question asked by Kim Sengupta of The Independent. And the question is, what is the panel's view, and Ewan, I'm going to turn to you first on this. What's the panel's view on the alliances being formed to counter China? Australia, Japan, the reboosting of the Quad. What are your views on that? Ewan, please.
Thank you, Bastian. Thank you, Kim, for the question. First thing is, let's get our definitions straight on alliances. The only alliances in the region are bilateral in nature and long-standing with the United States, as well as a bilateral alliance between China and North Korea. Everything else is really a question of alignment, and that's a much fuzzier space. But the quadrilateral has received a lot of attention of late, and I think the obvious reason for that is its logic is fundamentally balancing in nature. That balancing is partly military. So we have a neat symmetry in the Indo-Pacific. All 4 points on the compass are represented in that. We have United States, Japan, Australia, and India. And in aggregate terms, they obviously present a formidable amount of military capability, especially in the maritime space. But I think we also need to be careful in not overreading that. This is still an inchoate and informal arrangement, one that can be expected really to operate at the level of coordination and deconfliction. And perhaps if we do see it ramping up into the military space, naval exercises, we had a harbinger of that earlier, well, just a few months ago with the resurrection of the Malabar exercise in the Eastern Indian Ocean. So There is a hard power element to it, but I think it's important to caution that these are not alliances with NATO-like implications or Article 5 obligations.
Ewan, thank you very much. I'd like to turn to a set of questions that center on defense economics in one form or other. So it's primarily for Fenella McCarthy, and there are two aspects to this as well. If we expect the effects of the pandemic to hit defense spending with some delay, Fenella, what are the kinds of indicators and signals you would be looking for to show us that the time for those impacts is nearing, whether it's 2022 or 2023, but what are the things you'd be looking for? And the other question is more Europe specific, namely whether those increases that we have seen and tracked in European defense spending, whether that is Europe digging itself out of the hole that it has created by previous cuts, or whether we are actually now seeing a real boost to capability as a result of that. Fenella, if you can tackle those two, so the question of delay, and then the question of what does European defense increases really mean, Fenella.
Thanks, Bastian. So in terms of the delay and the impact that might come through, I think the signals that will be apparent will be a certain withdrawal from international operations. We've perhaps sort of seen that so far with kind of US global posture review and that pull back a little bit from Europe. So whereas what we saw in the last crisis, it was investment and procurement and R&D, certain signals so far indicate that this spending has been prioritized or ring-fenced. Certainly a lot of the uplift for the UK budget was ring-fenced and already pre-allocated for those newer technologies. So I think there is that recognition that over the last 10 years or so, there was perhaps a loss of capability or a decline in spending, and that meant that investment in newer technologies and in R&D did suffer. Obviously, European spending only managed to recover in real terms in 2019 to sort of 2009 peak levels. So it took about a decade to recover in real terms. So we've gotten back to that point, and it's now moving on to see whether that investment can continue. As we said in the opening sort of statements, that increase so far, it's in a sense there is digging yourself out of that hole, but I'm fairly optimistic that there have been lessons learned. There is that more of a determination to avoid those cuts that we saw. That said, it might be that countries find that they get to a point where it's too difficult to continue ring fencing defense. The economic contractions in the wake of the pandemic were sizable, were more severe than in the last financial crisis, and they were more global. So where previously we had growth in Asia, growth in the Middle East, supporting global spending, that might not necessarily be the case, certainly not in the case of the Middle East, where the oil prices really affected spending there. So in terms of maintaining that growth, I think Europe will perhaps start to find it more difficult once fiscal realities start to bite, if you can call it that, as fiscal deficits have extended to kind of quite unprecedented levels, and that will start to impact. But a lot of countries, I think, are having a slight reassessment in their acceptable levels of debt, acceptable levels of fiscal deficit. So that drive towards austerity, that drive to slash spending, I don't think will be as strong, but it cannot be ignored. So it will be a slight balance. It won't be as severe, I don't think, as in the wake of the financial crisis, but it will start to bite in the next 3 to 4 years. Thank you.
No, thank you very much. If I can stay with you just for one follow-up angle that is also in the question set that is being submitted. Do you think there is will nations struggle to spend the money when they have significant increases? The UK increase is significant. Germany over the last couple of years had years where the boost was really quite significant. And so there is a challenge of spending that extra money efficiently and effectively. Do you think that is an issue, or are nations doing more or less okay on that?
I think with the UK, even though there was that uplift, I think there are still affordability concerns within the equipment plan, because so much of that funding was already ring-fenced, was already pre-allocated. Those programs that were already in the existing equipment plan, while that's easing financial pressure, it's not completely funding, it's not completely easing that affordability pressure. So I think in the UK, issues with spending that new money won't be as much of a factor. I think Germany has perhaps become more efficient in these areas where we had that huge increase in 2019, or that significant increase in 2019, and it was spent effectively. NATO countries have been reorienting their defence budget, and we have seen that refocus on the investment spending, so procurement and R&D. So I think that more efficient spending and slightly more agile in defence budget allocations and planning and kind of more strategic outlooks. I think maybe I'm being too optimistic. I think I am a little bit, but I think there is that recognition, and I think certainly a drive, at least, or an ambition to be more efficient. But certainly, if you kind of flood the estate, flood the defence infrastructure or agencies with new funding, they will find ways of spending it, but the oversight will be key in ensuring that the right money goes to the right places. Thank you.
Fenella, thank you very much. I'd like to turn to James Hackett next, and come back to that issue of resilience, readiness, and effect on the armed forces of the pandemic. And there's a question here in the questions that are being submitted. What kind of capabilities are we looking at in that sense to have an impact on resilience, perhaps have a particular role in hybrid scenarios? What would you say can we observe from what nations have done to improve their position in that area? James.
Thanks, Bastian. I think it's important to consider that most, but certainly not all, military equipment capabilities are procured for combat purposes. I said most. Some armed forces, of course, are postured for other tasks, such as border security, internal security, and such like. Some military equipment capabilities can be used in civil contingencies. Examples, of course, are ready to hand: plant machinery, medical support, the ability to rapidly construct, as we saw in the United Kingdom, hospital facilities, as can civil equipment, of course, as well. But it's, I think, the people that are the most flexible capability that can be used, their adaptability. A key military capability, we tend to think of capability in terms of equipment all the time. A key military capability was logistics, expertise and experience, but also planning and leadership support. And that's why I mentioned in my remarks the sort of potentially new model of command and control planning for resilience more broadly. If integrated command and controls are exercised in peacetime, moreover, there is every possibility that nations could be better prepared for the wide range, the breadth of complex crises and contingencies that could arrive. As I mentioned, one of the potential risks is assuming that the next crisis will be the same as the current one. So maintaining adaptability in terms of equipment procurements, but also focusing on military skills in terms of being able to plug in planning and leadership support where needed, but not wait until a crisis erupts. Doing it in advance and better preparing, I think, is one of the key lessons.
James, thank you very much. We have a couple of minutes left, so I want to get in another set of questions that are China and maritime related. So I will, in a moment, again turn to Maya and Nick primarily. And it's a question that was submitted by Dom Nichols of The Telegraph. and it is, what lessons should we draw from China's development of the Djibouti base? So what does it tell us about the global security footprint and the defense footprint that China is developing? And then more specifically also, what does that tell us about the PLA Navy's blue water aspirations? So maybe I can start with Maya to speak a little bit about those global aspirations, the developing global security defense footprint of China, and then turn to Nick to speak specifically about the naval and maritime ambitions. Maya.
Thank you. So in terms of the Djibouti base, what I think in particular raised concerns about outside of China is the potential for further bases to be developed in order to support that global power projection and in particular blue water naval capability that Beijing is building. To date, we really haven't seen great moves towards building new bases like the logistics support base that the PLA has in Djibouti. When it comes to, for example, securing Belt and Road Initiative investments abroad, the Chinese government still relies more heavily on private security companies, of which there are roughly 20, both across land and maritime, in order to play that security role, in order to not have to put boots on the ground abroad and not have to risk militarizing what it sees as a socio-economic project. Will we see more bases in the future? Obviously, from a logistics, a maintenance and a support perspective, that is likely. But as I said before, the priorities for Beijing militarily and in terms of its main security threats and concerns are still in the next few years likely to be closer to home than further away. Thank you.
Maya, thank you very much. Nick.
Thank you, Bastian. And yes, I very much endorse everything Maya said, particularly about the Djibouti base. I think it's interesting that so far it is the only support base that has been established at range by China, but it is interesting, apart from anything else, in its not only its capabilities and scale, but also its location, which I think talks to some of the long-range priority concerns as far as China and its maritime interests are concerned. It's adjacent to the Middle East and the sources of a large and significant part of China's hydrocarbons, but it's also on the choke point between the Indian Ocean, which is an extremely important conduit as far as Chinese maritime interests and trade flows is concerned, and not only that, but on through into Europe and beyond. And I think that is indicative of the priorities as far as China's sort of broad maritime focus is concerned. As far as the blue water naval ambitions specifically are concerned, I think in some ways we are possibly at an inflection point in terms of China's ability to move beyond the deployments that it has been making up to now at long range, for in many cases for specific security reasons, like the counter-piracy operation in the North Arabian Sea, but also some limited further deployments to develop relationships with partners like Russia and to establish a presence in certain other areas. But it is a characteristic of the significant developments that we've seen in China's maritime capabilities that they've not only been at scale, but they've been across the breadth of capabilities, including support capabilities, auxiliaries, and the like that are able to support at range. So I think that potentially we will see a further development of long-range deployments as far as China is concerned. An interesting one will be when a Chinese carrier group makes a long-range deployment of significance, potentially into the Indian Ocean. And I think this is, if you like, the conduit and route in which we will see further capability and deployment aspirations see fruit into the Indian Ocean, where there has already been a growing Chinese presence, and through that beyond. There are also potential further avenues and routes that might open up in the longer term, as far as China's ambitions to have a presence even further afield, maybe even into the Atlantic. And that is what happens in the Arctic and high north, particularly in terms of route access there, and what that does in terms of the dilemmas that China faces as far as protecting its maritime interests at range are concerned.
Nick, thank you very much. We are at 11 sharp in London. I want to get one more question in on the on air and missile defense, and I'm going to turn to Douglas to primarily tackle that. That's a question about the balance of investment, given that the threat landscape includes, or the threat vectors include hypersonic missiles, they include UAVs, and they include everything in between. So as nations think about reconfiguring their air and missile defense capability suites, how would you go about that? I mean, how do you balance the higher end versus the rest of the threat vectors? Douglas.
Thanks, Bastian. It's a really interesting question, to which there is absolutely no easy answer at all. Partly, I would imagine it boils down to your threat analysis, where you see your major challenges, who your peer rival might be, and what they have in their inventory. Then to look at your own technology base, your own current inventory, how much money you might have. Missile defense is many things, but it isn't cheap. And then work your way through what you might want. My own perspective is traditional air defense remains very important. So the ability to deal with air-breathing threats, all the way from small swarming UAVs through cruise missiles through to traditional crewed combat aircraft. Beyond that, you then have the issue of ballistic missile defense. There is an open debate still ongoing about how effective this is. You can probably protect against a limited threat, but against a massed ballistic missile attack, your capacity to deal with that remains very questionable indeed. That's not necessarily a reason not to try and do it, but it remains a pretty limited, very distinct number of countries who will be able to do that at the national level. Beyond that, within alliance constructs, then there may be another way to address it. Simply go back to saying it's a very thorny problem.
Douglas, thank you very much. Thank you very much for joining us for the launch of the Military Balance 2021. We did not get to all of the questions that were raised. If you have additional ones, feel free to send them to the IISS press and media team, and we will see whether we can help you with analysis and data. Thank you very much for joining us, and we hope to see you soon at an IISS webinar, and we hope you find the new Military Balance and the Military Balance Plus database useful for your work. Thank you very much. Have a nice rest of the day. Thank you. Bye-bye.